Alright, my main concern here is I want to make sure that I don't scrape as I leave the garage now that we're lower than we were before. Listen for it. Oh, we're good. So in my last video, I think it was my last video, someone was complaining about how I didn't have an in-camera mount. So went out, bought one. It's already on my list, but we'll let this person have that win. So I'm gonna attach the camera to that right now. This is actually what it looks like. Let's see how this comes across. So right now I've got like 3 suction cups up here, and then this is a top handle for my Canon camera. And then I'll have to move the microphone and everything and reattach it, but I'll get that set up right now, and then I'll show you guys what that looks like, and then we'll get on to the rest of the video. Oh man. Alright, so that's the camera set up, and now I feel like I've wasted like 20 minutes just getting a camera to get like ready to go, but I think this is going to look a lot better. I think this is going to be way more interesting. You'll be able to hear the car better, hopefully. And just generally, it'll be easier for me to talk, drive, and it should be a little bit more relatable. So before I get into this video, your guys' support has been really awesome. We've grown to, I think we're a little bit over 70 subscribers now, and I think with just the small number of videos that I've put out, that's just, again, I've said it in previous videos, but it's much more than I expected. So thank you guys so much for like actually signing up for this and following along with my journey and my ownership experience and showing interest and talking in the comments and all of that. It's been great. So if you've watched more than one of these videos now, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. That's the best way to show that you're like following along. That'll let me know to keep creating more of these. If you want to unsubscribe at any point, please do, but like knowing that people are following is what helps drive me to make these videos, especially on a weekly basis. For example, we're going on a trip next week, so I'm gonna have to film another video in the next few days to get out ahead of things and have something ready to go for next week. But knowing that this is growing and that people care is what really drives me to put in that extra effort to throw 2 videos together this week, and then we'll see where we go from here. Thanks again, guys. First, I'm gonna go warm the car up. It'll make better sounds and stuff if it's warm, and then we'll start talking. Oh man, I'm stoked about this actually. One of the things that I tried out yesterday was a different mount, and so this video is actually a little bit delayed coming up because the mount that I had didn't really work out with the weight of my camera and the whole setup, and so I'm hoping that this will work out much better. Alright, so the video that I wanted to shoot today is just talking a little bit about the cars that I got out of when I jumped into the Alfa Romeo. So I've owned BMWs and Porsches, yeah, exclusively except for the 2 Alfa Romeos that I've owned. As a BMW person, it was kind of a big deal for me to switch brands. A lot of BMW people are super loyal, and I wasn't really an exception to that. So before I bought my first Quadrifoglio, I had a Long Beach blue M2. It was a DCT car. It was one of the first ones that you could get in the United States. Actually, it was the first one delivered in Colorado, as far as I know, but the person who bought it and originally ordered it, I guess had a collection of cars, and he had decided it was too many and had to return that one. I benefited from getting probably the first used M2 sold in the United States at a time where there was about a year to a year and a half wait to get an M2. I didn't have to pay much of a premium for that, but it was a really cool car. I enjoyed it a lot. Yeah, it was just an enjoyable car to drive. I bought that car instead of buying an F80 M3. I was actually on my way to buy an F80 that day, but I got a call that this used M2 came up at a different dealership that I'd already been talking to, so I went ahead and literally just went to a different dealership that day and drove that car and bought it same day. It was just night and day difference. I think it was hard for me to reconcile how much I didn't actually like the F80 after the previous M3s that I've owned. So I had an E92 M3, it was a 2008 coupe. And then I had a E36 M3 that was also a coupe, that was a 97. Both were great cars. I had a 335i as well. I had a 318 Ti, which is a weird little E36 hatchback that was out for a few years. So I know my BMWs. I'd had several BMWs. I drank that Kool-Aid. I was really into that brand. But I saw the Alfa Romeo come out. It seemed really interesting. It seemed really kind of different in this segment. And so I wanted to go ahead and get a test drive in on one of those. And that's kind of when I was hooked, honestly. I did my first test drive and it wasn't long after that that I put in an order for a car. I want to talk a little bit about coming from an M2 and how I think this car compares to the M2 and the F80 M3, and why I like this one a lot better. I think this is a much more interesting car in the segment. There's a road up here that I'm going to give a quick little thrashing on, and we'll see how the audio comes through and everything. This car is almost too fast for back roads, and I think in race mode it's actually super dangerous on a lot of them, just because having the traction control off is not something that people are used to. But it's the only way that I've driven my Quadrifoglios, because to get the full exhaust sound in an OEM car, you have to be in race mode. So coming out of the M2, the things that I really liked about that car were the dual clutch transmission. It was comfortable, it was a smaller wheelbase, it felt really nimble. Lived in Colorado when I got that car, and it was just really nice to drive that car through twisty mountain roads. It was a great car. It was phenomenal. It felt superior to the F80 M3 to me. I think just being a little bit smaller, more nimble, and I think the car was a little bit better balanced. And I was actually one of those people who was disappointed when the M2 came out because it didn't have a real M engine. It didn't have an S engine. It was running the N55 with, sure, a tune from BMW M, but it's just not the same as having a bespoke M engine. I think especially having owned a E92 M3 with the S65 in it, it's just, that engine ruins other BMW engines for people. But the N55 in that car was really, really good, and I ended up liking it a lot more than some of the characteristics of the S55 from the F80 M3, M4. Namely, what I didn't like about the M3 engine is that it felt like it had a weird surge of power midway through the rev range, and so if you weren't awake, you could really get out in that car. Compare that to the Giulia and the Quadrifoglio, and I think that this car's a lot more predictable when it loses traction. This car makes a lot of power. In race mode, it will spin the tires, but I think it's way more predictable when you lose it, and to be able to manage it and then control the throttle. The looks of the M2 were great. I love that. Again, it kind of goes back to the whole body, but the compact body was cool. The boxy fender flares were really neat. It was just, it was a different car. It was super aggressive looking. It kind of brought in that new, more angular BMW styling, the fangs and all of that. But I think the M2 suffers a little bit of having the M3 and M4 to compete with internally. That heritage that those cars have is super significant and shouldn't be downplayed. And at least when I owned mine, because it was kind of early in the lifespan of the M2, it was before the competition came out, there weren't a lot of mods available. There was some stuff that you could do. I put some carbon bits on mine, modified it slightly. There just wasn't the options that existed on the M3. That was something that actually started to draw me to the M3 prior to the M2 becoming available, was just that platform for being able to modify a car. So coming into looking at the M3 was really exciting. There was a bunch of stuff that you could do to modify and really personalize an M3, and that was really appealing. The M2 just drove so much better that I threw all that out the window. Funny enough, my wife still says to this day that the M2 was her favorite car of mine that she ever drove. Yeah, she loved driving that car, so it really is a phenomenal little car. It's a lot of fun. I'll also say that what BMW offers that Alfa Romeo does not whatsoever is this really, really well thought out, tried and true, iterated on time after time kind of interior pattern and all of that. And what I mean by that is if you jump into any modern BMW, the button layout of everything makes a ton of sense. You can tell someone spent time considering what a driver is going to do sitting in a car. Certain buttons are placed in certain ways. It's very, very intuitive. And in a car like this, not as much. I think that Alfa Romeo took a cue from the Germans when developing this car, because it does feel like things are laid out pretty well, especially for a FCA product. But the BMW, you could just tell that someone had the job of agonizing over where every button went and why, and making it super intuitive. And it shows a lot in those cars. I think the things that really pulled me away from BMW and pulled me towards the Giulia still stand, and the refinements made on those cars over the years haven't negated the reasons that I really like this car. One thing I don't really like about this car is how loud the turn signal is. It's so loud. So something that is very different about the Giulia is, I mean, just starting from the driving position and everything here, it's very different having this red start-stop button. It just immediately tells you this car is a little bit different. It feels a little bit more high-end. It feels like there's a lot of Ferrari influence as soon as you sit in this car, sit behind the flat-bottom steering wheel, and it just immediately it feels a bit special. I think the carbon-backed seats in this car are really, really cool, and it feels more exotic than the Germans. The Germans have played everything so safe that it's started to feel a little bit stale. Even in some of the higher end models from competitors where the seats are a little bit sportier and more interesting than in the BMWs, it still just feels very safe. And then you talk about the big metal paddles behind the steering wheel. Again, feels very Ferrari-esque and just feels very exciting. Oh man. It was a E60 M5. So cool. That was the V10 M5. Let's see if he wants to follow. Looks like he might. Talking about BMWs, making comparisons, and then possibly the most exotic BMW pulls up. Yeah. And I forgot what I was talking about. This car kind of feels like a mini exotic car in a lot of ways when you're in it. And I think on the outside, the looks are super different too. Again, the Germans kind of play it safe, but they have this. They all had these like base cars that they built a really good looking car on top of. The interesting thing about the Giulia Quadrifoglio, at least, was they built this car first and then they built the other cars back from it. I think that's really cool, and I think it shows. I think that trickled down to the other cars, and it's super interesting. The Giulia also forgoes the individual customization that you get in a lot of the other cars. That was actually really nice about the M2. The M2 didn't let you customize every single aspect of the driving experience. You had like a Sport and a Sport Plus button. Kind of didn't really have much control over the individual options of that. That's nice because you're not really suffering from like analysis paralysis where you don't know what settings work best and you kind of feel numb to all of it and there's just too many decisions. The Giulia is a little bit more like the M2 in that way, in that you have this dial with the DNA selector that also has race mode. And so you can have your dynamic mode, your natural mode, your advanced efficiency mode, but you don't have much control over the individual settings within that. So I have no control over the throttle response when I'm in each mode. And I don't have any control over the steering when I'm in each mode. But I do have the ability to adjust the suspension a little bit. So you have a harsh setting, an intermediate, and then you have a soft setting. And when you're in race mode, by default, you're going to be in your harshest. And then you can hit the suspension button once, and it will dial it back to the softest, one level softer. And so when you're in race mode, you hit that button, you are now in dynamics default suspension mode. You can't make it harsher than whatever mode you're in. So in dynamic mode, I can't make it as harsh as race mode. In my opinion, that's the perfect level of customization that you need in drive selectors. I think that being able to change your steering and really make this all very individual is a little bit too much. I think that the engineers who develop the car should have the best idea of what the settings are. They probably know better than I do, and I know some people like fine-tuning that stuff, but I think it's just a little bit too much. I kind of like that the Italians said, these are the modes you get, this is what they do. You can make it a little bit softer if you're about to go over a railroad track, but otherwise, this is what you get. The steering response in the Giulia is also so good. It is such a fast steering ratio, and the smallest inputs make such a difference in the way that you drive it. and it feels way more nimble than other performance sedans. I'm specific about saying performance sedans because this isn't a sports car class of car. This is a performance sedan. This competes with the M3, the RS5. It doesn't compete with a 911 in terms of all-around package. This car doesn't make the same compromises that those cars make. It might be more well-rounded and better suited for daily driving and normal use of a car, but it's not going to be as strong of a performer. We can also talk about the elephant in the room, which is the exhaust note. The F80 M3 does not sound good. I think the M2 sounds pretty good, actually. I think it sounds a lot better than the S55 did and has in all the different platforms and everything that I've heard it in. There's been a couple of applications where I've heard the S55 sound alright, but it's just not the greatest sounding BMW engine. And that's disappointing from a company that put out the S65. The S54 sounded good. I would even say that the S52 sounded good. Even the US spec one that was, well, we only got the S52. Some great sounding engines. And we know that they can produce a good sounding 6-cylinder, so I don't necessarily know what happened there. But I thought the M2 sounded pretty good. I think with an exhaust it sounds nice. It's not amazing, but it's good. It's a lot more respectable than I think the M3 sounds. A little less farty and rattly and just kind of weird. But the Giulia sounds crazy when it's not in dynamic mode. I mean, you could probably hear the difference here. It basically goes silent. But the Giulia with the valves open sounds great. You get really awesome bangs on the upshift. You get these crazy violent whip cracks on the downshifts under certain situations, and it's different. Other cars don't necessarily sound like this one. I think it does have a very distinct sound, and I really appreciate it. I think it's a little bit of a struggle when you look at aftermarket exhausts to see what you can do with the car, where it can go, and how to increase certain sounds and volume. I think it's we definitely don't benefit on this platform from having the same number of buyers as the M3 does. And I think that really shows on the aftermarket, in particular the exhausts, where there aren't a lot of exhaust manufacturers, and then when there are a significant number of manufacturers, or there are different options out there, there aren't that many people to buy and try them out, and then of those people, even fewer actually record videos and upload the content and stuff that you need to make an informed buying decision. So it's definitely one of those platforms where if you can't hear it in person, you're probably not going to have any good idea of what an exhaust sounds like. I came out of the M2 also wanting something that was a little bit bigger, and so that's why the M3 or the Giulia was an option for me. Yeah, I just wanted a little bit more size. I wanted to try out having a 4-door car. I didn't actually need more size, just the M2 is kind of small, and I think when you want to do, play around a little bit, a longer wheelbase can be fun. I had an F80 M3 on loan a couple of times, just to make sure that's a car that I wanted. I was able to take them overnight and drive them and live with them and make sure that was the right decision for me. And the one that I decided that I was going to buy, I think I was still convincing myself that day, so the fact that the M2 came up was perfect for me, because I didn't buy a car that I wasn't all in on. I would have made it my own and enjoyed it in its own way, but from the factory I just don't think it's as fun of a car as something like this. So I hope this has been interesting to you guys. This is a little bit of a different format than the last couple of videos. It's similar, but it's different, and I really just wanted to chat about the cars that I came from and then coming into this one and what that decision-making process looked like. I mean, I talked before about things that I've liked about the Giulia, but never before have I really talked about how it stacks up to the cars that I have owned or really, really, really considered. And I think that there are probably people out there making similar purchasing decisions, looking at, do I want the Giulia Quadrifoglio and do I want to take that chance, or do I want the F80 M3 that's tried and proven and people have had and modified like crazy? And for someone who wants to do a little bit of modification and maybe wants a little bit more power but doesn't need a full bolt-on car, I think the Quadrifoglio is perfect. I think that a little bit of exhaust modification makes it sound even better. You don't have a bunch of artificial sounds like you do with a lot of the BMW burble tunes. People who block intersections value their time more than other people's, and it is so selfish and annoying. Don't block intersections. Be a good driver. Be a good person. Wear a mask. I've heard multiple people saying recently, if masks work so well, we should reopen sporting events and everyone should wear a mask, because if masks are so effective, then everything should be fine. Hey, you know what's more effective than something that's pretty effective? Not going to a thing and spreading something at all. Alright, I got nothing else.